Kristina Joksimović was the epitome of beauty and grace. Born in Serbia, she immigrated to Switzerland as a child, carrying with her dreams of a better life. By her early 20s, she had become a household name, captivating audiences as a finalist in the prestigious Miss Switzerland pageant. To the public, she was a symbol of elegance, charm, and ambition, a shining star in the world of fashion and beauty. Yet, beneath the surface, Kristina's life was far more complicated than it appeared. While her career flourished in modeling and public appearances, her personal life was marked by turbulence. She met her husband, a wealthy entrepreneur, during her rise to fame. At first, their relationship was a whirlwind romance, marked by lavish trips, extravagant gifts, and a seemingly perfect love story. However, behind closed doors, the relationship began to show cracks. Her husband, whose name became synonymous with control and obsession in the aftermath of the crime, was known for his temper and domineering personality. Friends noticed how Kristina's once vibrant energy began to dim. She became more reserved, often declining social invitations and withdrawing from her closest confidants. Despite her struggles, Kristina maintained her public image with unwavering poise. She continued to grace magazine covers, smiling for the cameras even as her personal life unraveled. Few could have guessed the silent battles she fought daily, torn between a desire to protect her career and the growing fear of her husband's volatile behavior. Kristina's beauty and success masked a tragic truth: she was trapped in a life that no amount of fame or fortune could rescue her from. As the tension in her marriage escalated, so too did the danger lurking just out of sight, until it finally consumed her. To outsiders, Kristina Joksimović and her husband appeared to have it all. Their opulent lifestyle, lavish dinners at exclusive restaurants, luxury cars, and a sprawling villa in a picturesque Swiss town, was the envy of many. But beneath the glittering surface, their marriage was unraveling at a dangerous pace. Kristina's husband, a man who had built his fortune through shrewd business ventures, was used to being in control. His public persona was polished, a charismatic businessman with an eye for success. Privately, however, his behavior was marked by obsessive tendencies and an explosive temper. Over time, his love for Kristina seemed to shift into something darker, a need to possess her entirely. The signs of trouble had been there from the start. Friends recalled instances where Kristina would brush off subtle remarks about her husband's jealousy or his demands for her to abandon her career and focus solely on being a wife. Over time, these demands grew into ultimatums. He resented the public attention she garnered and became increasingly controlling of her movements, her contacts, and even her finances. Kristina, fiercely independent by nature, resisted his attempts to dominate her life. But her defiance came at a cost. Their arguments grew louder and more frequent, echoing through the walls of their home. On several occasions, neighbors reported hearing shouting matches late into the night. Kristina confided in a close friend that she was unhappy and felt trapped in the marriage. She spoke of her husband's unpredictable mood swings, his accusations of infidelity, and his growing paranoia. "He loves me, but it's not the kind of love I want," she admitted in a rare moment of vulnerability. Yet, despite her misgivings, she hesitated to leave. There were practical reasons: her husband's financial power and influence made her fearful of the repercussions. But there were also emotional ties. Kristina had once loved him deeply, and part of her still hoped that the man she had fallen for might re-emerge. As months turned into years, the cracks in their relationship deepened. Kristina began to distance herself from the modeling world, a move many attributed to her husband's pressure. Her once regular social media posts grew sporadic, her radiant smile replaced by carefully curated captions and distant expressions. The turning point came when Kristina started quietly exploring her options for leaving. She began consulting a lawyer, gathering evidence of her husband's controlling behavior in case she needed to protect herself. She also reconnected with old friends, seeking the support she knew she would need to escape the gilded cage she had been trapped in. But Kristina underestimated just how far her husband's need for control would drive him. In his eyes, Kristina's growing independence wasn't just a threat to their marriage, it was a betrayal. And betrayal, he believed, was something he could not tolerate. The tension between them reached a breaking point one cold evening in late winter, when an argument over something seemingly trivial spiraled into an explosive confrontation. For Kristina, it was yet another sign that she had to get out. But for her husband, it was the final confirmation that she was slipping beyond his grasp. Unbeknownst to Kristina, her every move was being watched. Her attempts to break free weren't just creating distance, they were setting the stage for a storm that would end in unthinkable violence. It was an unremarkable winter evening, cloaked in the kind of stillness that made the events that followed all the more chilling. Inside their elegant home, Kristina Joksimović moved through her routine with a quiet determination. She was no longer the carefree woman the world had once celebrated, the strain of her marriage weighed heavily on her, but she clung to her plans to leave. She believed she was close to reclaiming her freedom. Her husband, however, sensed the shift. In the weeks leading up to that night, his demeanor had grown colder, his temper sharper. Kristina's every action seemed to feed his growing paranoia. The legal consultations she thought were private were not as discreet as she hoped. He had hired a private investigator and had been tracking her movements for months. To him, her plans to leave weren't just an affront, they were an existential threat to his carefully constructed world. That night, the couple's interaction began as it often did, with simmering tension. A trivial disagreement over dinner escalated quickly, as their arguments often did. Kristina, exhausted from years of emotional warfare, tried to disengage. She told him she needed space and retreated to their bedroom. But for her husband, this was no ordinary argument. He had convinced himself that Kristina's defiance was proof of her betrayal. Fueled by a dangerous mix of jealousy, rage, and obsession, he stormed into the bedroom, demanding answers she couldn't give. The confrontation turned physical. Kristina, stunned by his aggression, fought back, but he overpowered her. In the heat of the moment, the man who once claimed to love her crossed an irreversible line. He wrapped his hands around her throat, and as her struggles weakened, a chilling silence fell over the room. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at her lifeless body on the floor. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, but his remorse was fleeting. Panic quickly set in as he realized the enormity of his crime. He wasn't just a jealous husband anymore, he was a murderer. Driven by a cold, calculating instinct, he began to think about how to cover up the crime. He knew Kristina's disappearance would spark immediate suspicion. Her connections to the media and her public profile made her absence impossible to ignore. He needed a way to ensure no trace of her would ever be found. He moved her body to the kitchen, a grim resolve overtaking him as he surveyed the tools at his disposal. He retrieved a heavy-duty blender, a device meant for culinary creations but now repurposed for something far more sinister. Piece by piece, he worked to dispose of her remains, blending them and pouring the macabre mixture into drains, containers, and trash bags he planned to scatter far from their home. The gruesome process took hours. By the time he finished, dawn was beginning to break. He meticulously cleaned the house, scrubbing away any trace of what had happened. Every surface, every corner of the room where Kristina had drawn her last breath, was wiped down with surgical precision. To further obscure his crime, he began crafting a narrative. He sent messages from her phone to friends and family, pretending she had decided to leave for a few days to clear her head. He even staged evidence to suggest she had packed a bag and left the house voluntarily. But no amount of planning could erase the cracks in his facade. Neighbors noticed his strange behavior, the late-night comings and goings, the tense look on his face as he carried heavy bags to his car. And as Kristina's loved ones grew increasingly concerned about her sudden disappearance, they began to press for answers. What her husband hadn't counted on was that Kristina's friends and family knew her too well. They knew she wouldn't leave without telling someone, and they knew she had been afraid of him. Their suspicions soon turned to him, and the walls of his carefully constructed alibi began to close in. In his attempt to silence Kristina forever, he had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately bring the truth to light. But on that night, as he stared out at the pale winter sky, he believed he had gotten away with it. Kristina's sudden disappearance sent immediate shockwaves through her close-knit circle of friends and family. Known for her warm demeanor and punctuality, she was not the type to vanish without explanation. Her absence, coupled with the cryptic text messages sent from her phone, felt entirely out of character. The messages lacked her usual tone, short, vague, and devoid of the warmth that marked her communication. Suspicion quickly mounted. The police were notified within days. The investigation began as a missing persons case, with officers combing through Kristina's last known movements. Her husband, ever the calculating actor, played the role of the concerned spouse to perfection. He told investigators that Kristina had been under a lot of stress and had left the house of her own accord. He even suggested she might have been overwhelmed by the pressures of her career and their marital issues. At first, there was little concrete evidence to contradict his claims. Surveillance footage showed Kristina entering her home the night she disappeared, but there was no footage of her leaving. Her phone, meanwhile, had been turned off hours after the suspicious texts were sent, and her bank accounts showed no recent activity. However, cracks in his story began to appear almost immediately. Neighbors recalled seeing him behaving strangely in the days following Kristina's disappearance, carrying heavy trash bags to his car late at night and meticulously scrubbing his driveway with cleaning products. A neighbor's security camera even captured footage of him making multiple trips to the garbage bins in the dead of night. When police questioned him about these activities, he dismissed them as routine chores. But his nervous demeanor, coupled with his overly rehearsed responses, raised red flags. The breakthrough came when forensic experts were brought in to analyze the couple's home. Despite his obsessive cleaning, trace amounts of blood were discovered in the kitchen and bathroom, areas he had clearly focused on scrubbing. Tests confirmed that the blood belonged to Kristina. Simultaneously, investigators traced the heavy-duty trash bags to a landfill site. After days of sifting through mountains of garbage, they uncovered fragments of human remains. Although heavily decomposed, the remains bore unmistakable signs of mutilation, evidence of an attempt to dismember and destroy Kristina's body. The discovery of the remains shifted the case from a missing persons investigation to a homicide. Forensic analysts pieced together what had happened. Kristina had been killed in her home, and her body had been disposed of in a grotesque manner in an attempt to erase all evidence. Her husband was immediately brought in for further questioning. By then, the mounting evidence made it impossible for him to maintain his facade. His alibi unraveled under scrutiny, and inconsistencies in his timeline were exposed. Detectives, armed with the blood evidence and the discovery of the remains, confronted him with the stark reality of their findings. Adding to the pressure, Kristina's friends provided critical testimony about the escalating tensions in her marriage. They revealed that Kristina had confided in them about her fears, describing her husband as controlling and manipulative. She had been planning to leave him, a fact that painted a clear motive for the crime. The case against him grew airtight when forensic specialists analyzed the couple's home appliances. The blender he had used was found to contain microscopic traces of human tissue, and chemical residue on the kitchen countertops matched cleaning agents used to mask biological evidence. Faced with a mountain of evidence, the once calm and composed man began to unravel. He denied his involvement until the end, but the investigation had already sealed his fate. What had started as a missing persons case had turned into a chilling tale of premeditation and brutality. Kristina's husband, a man once admired for his charm and professionalism, was now the prime suspect in one of the most gruesome crimes the country had ever seen. The evidence told a damning story, one that he could no longer hide from. As the case headed to trial, the investigation team, Kristina's loved ones, and the public waited for justice to be served. But the true horror of what had happened inside that house would remain etched in their memories forever. The trial of Kristina Joksimović's husband captivated the nation. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that drew public attention, it was the stark contrast between his carefully curated public persona and the heinous acts he was accused of committing. The courtroom became a stage for the dramatic unraveling of a man who had meticulously controlled his image for years. From the outset, the prosecution built an airtight case. Forensic evidence became the cornerstone of their argument. The traces of Kristina's blood in the kitchen and bathroom, the human tissue found in the blender, and the recovered remains from the landfill all pointed to premeditation and a calculated attempt to destroy evidence. Prosecutors presented a harrowing timeline, showing how Kristina's husband had planned and executed the murder. Witness testimony painted an even darker picture of their marriage. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues testified about the husband's controlling behavior, his jealousy, and Kristina's growing fear of him in the weeks leading up to her death. The defense, in contrast, struggled to construct a plausible narrative. Their initial strategy was to claim that Kristina had left voluntarily and fallen victim to an unknown assailant, but the overwhelming forensic evidence quickly made this argument untenable. As the trial progressed, they pivoted to an argument of temporary insanity, suggesting that years of marital strain had pushed him into a momentary lapse of control. This defense did little to sway the jury. His demeanor in court, cold, detached, and occasionally defiant, only served to alienate him further. Observers noted how he seemed more concerned with defending his reputation than expressing remorse for what had happened to Kristina. The prosecution's closing arguments were devastating. They emphasized the brutality of the crime, the calculated steps he took to cover it up, and the profound loss felt by Kristina's family and friends. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning their verdict, guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. The sentencing phase was equally gripping. Kristina's family and friends gave emotional impact statements, describing her as a bright, compassionate woman whose life had been stolen far too soon. Her mother's words left the courtroom in tears, "She was my light, my everything. And now, because of him, that light has been extinguished forever." The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The severity of the sentence reflected not only the cruelty of the crime but also the deep betrayal of trust it represented. In the wake of the trial, Kristina's death left a lasting impact on those who knew her and the wider community. Her tragic story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of hidden domestic violence, even in relationships that appeared picture-perfect to the outside world. Her family established a foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic abuse and raising awareness about the warning signs of controlling relationships. The foundation also advocated for reforms in laws surrounding domestic violence, aiming to provide better resources and protection for those at risk. The media, initially drawn to the lurid details of the case, eventually shifted its focus to Kristina's legacy. Documentaries and articles explored not just the crime but also her life, her beauty, talent, and the promise she had embodied. As for her husband, he remains a reviled figure, serving his sentence in a maximum security prison. He reportedly spends his days in isolation, ostracized even among other inmates for the gruesome nature of his crime. The trial and its aftermath ignited broader conversations about domestic violence, control, and the often hidden cracks in seemingly perfect relationships. Kristina Joksimović's story became a somber reminder of how darkness can lurk behind even the most glittering facades, and the importance of never ignoring the signs. Though Kristina's life was cut tragically short, her legacy endures, inspiring others to speak out, seek help, and work toward a world where such tragedies never happen again.